Panic erupts in Galactic Council as humans refuse to negotiate. The chair they gave me was too small. That was the first thing I noticed when I walked into the Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council. Not the ceiling, which rose so high above my head that clouds of pressurized vapor drifted near the top, like trapped weather. Not the 600 rows of tiered seating occupied by delegates from 400 different species, some of them so alien that my eyes could not find a shape in them that made sense. Not the deep, ancient hum of the translation arrays laced into every surface of the room, vibrating at a frequency just below hearing. No. The first thing I noticed was the chair. It was sized for a human, technically. The dimensions were close enough, but it sat at the very base of the chamber, on the lowest tier, positioned so that every single delegate in the room looked down at me. I had to tilt my head back just to see the arbiter's platform. Every other diplomatic seat in that chamber was elevated. Mine was not. It was a deliberate calculation. I was meant to feel it the moment I sat down. I sat down, I felt it, and then I decided it did not matter. My name is Lena Vasquez. I am 38 years old. I grew up in Bristol, England in a house that flooded twice before I turned 10. I joined Earth's diplomatic corps at 24. Spent 6 years posting to 3 different contested border stations, and I had negotiated everything from water rights disputes between orbital habitats to trade deadlocks that nearly shut down 2 colony systems. I had sat across tables from people who wanted to destroy everything I was trying to protect. I had learned, very early, that the size of the room has nothing to do with the outcome of what happens inside it. The Council's Grand Chamber on Valanthos Station had been in continuous operation for 12,000 years. 12,000. The oldest human civilization with written records was barely 5,000 years old. The Council had been convening, debating, legislating, and ruling over the known galaxy for more than twice that span. Its founding members had watched species rise and fall. They had seen wars that lasted centuries and peace agreements that lasted longer. They had absorbed new members, expelled old ones, and maintained a grip on interstellar governance so total and so ancient that most species in the galaxy had never known anything else. We had been summoned. The official charge delivered 3 weeks earlier by a Council courier drone that arrived in soul space without warning and transmitted its message on every diplomatic frequency simultaneously, was that Earth and its affiliated colony systems had committed acts of destabilization against the established order. Specifically, human explorers and settlers had entered and claimed 3-star systems in the Outer Rim that the Council had designated as protected transition zones under something called the Valanthos Accords, a treaty Earth had never signed because Earth had never been invited to sign it. The courier drone had also included, in precise and bureaucratic language, the Council's proposed remedy: a 200-year moratorium on human interstellar travel, all human vessels outside soul space to be recalled immediately, all human settlements beyond the home system to be placed under Council administration pending review, all Earth-based communications with external systems to be routed through Council-approved relay networks. 200 years. When the message reached the desk of Earth's Secretary of Outer Affairs, the man reportedly read it 3 times, set it down, and then did not speak for 11 minutes. I know this because I was in the room. I was already being briefed. I had been 60s before the drone arrived, as part of a contingency protocol that Earth's diplomatic leadership had quietly prepared after the 3rd incident in the Outer Rim. They had known something like this was coming. They had chosen me specifically because I had a reputation for keeping my composure when conversations went badly. What they had told me, in plain terms, was this: go to Valanthos, listen to the charges, be respectful, and then agree to negotiate the terms down to something survivable. The moratorium was the Council's opening position. Our job was to walk away with something like 10 years, maybe 20, with exceptions carved out for existing settlements. It would hurt. It would be humiliating. But it was the price of admission into a galaxy that humanity had not yet earned the right to move through freely. That was the plan. I had listened to the plan carefully. I had asked several questions. I had read every document, every brief, every historical precedent for how the Council had handled similar cases with other species. I had studied the transcripts of Earth's 4 previous attempts to negotiate membership in the Council over the past 80 years. I had looked at the outcomes of every species that had sat in that low chair at the base of the Grand Chamber and accepted the terms offered to it. And somewhere in the middle of all that reading, sitting alone in my cabin aboard the UES Resolute, 3 days out from Valanthos, I had made a different decision. The arbiter's name was Zorath. He was Velkon, one of the founding species of the Council, and he was enormous in the way that things built for authority are always enormous. 8 limbs, 4 of which he used for locomotion and 4 of which he used for gesture and expression. A body that shifted color depending on his emotional state, and a voice that the translation array rendered in my earpiece as something deep and measured and immovable, like the sound a mountain might make if it could speak. He had held the arbiter position for 60 years. He was, by all accounts, extremely good at it. He read the charges clearly and without theater. He did not need theater. The room itself was the theater. He simply stated what humanity had done, what the council had decided in response, and what Earth was now expected to do. Then he paused, and in that pause, 400 species leaned forward in their seats, and the translation arrays hummed a little louder, and the Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council waited for the human representative to begin her apology. I looked at my datapad. It had my prepared opening remarks on it. 4 paragraphs of carefully worded acknowledgement, followed by a formal request to discuss the terms of the proposed moratorium. Every word had been approved by 3 different committees back on Earth. It was a good statement, respectful, clear, and structured to open the door to a long negotiation. I looked at the datapad for a moment. I set it down on the small table beside my too small chair. I looked up at Arbiter Zorath, 8,000 kilometers above me on his platform, and I said in a clear and even voice a single word, "No." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 2 seconds. In that silence I heard absolutely nothing, and then everything happened at once. The translation arrays, which had been designed over thousands of years to handle every known form of communication in the galaxy, struggled with what I had just said, not because the word was complex. It was the simplest word in any language. They struggled because the arrays were calibrated for diplomatic context, for the vocabulary of negotiation and compromise, and a flat, unqualified refusal from a species in Earth's position had apparently never been entered into their reference models. There was a half-second of distortion, a kind of stuttering echo, as the word was processed and transmitted across the chamber in 400 languages. And then the chamber came apart. I do not mean this as a figure of speech. Delegates stood. Several of them stood on top of their chairs. The Quillari ambassador, a species I knew to be physiologically sensitive to sudden emotional shocks, went completely rigid and was caught by 2 aides before she hit the floor. The Dren section erupted in a sound that my translation array rendered as something between a question and an alarm. A Velcon subdelegate near the front tier actually moved backward, pressing into the delegate behind him, which caused a brief chain reaction of jostling that knocked over what appeared to be an extremely old ceremonial water vessel. Arbiter Zorath did not move. He stared at me. His body color, which had been a steady formal gray when he read the charges, shifted through 3 shades in rapid succession before settling on something my briefing documents had described as deep violet, associated with confusion and recalibration. "Representative Vasquez," he said, and his voice was still measured, still mountain steady, but there was something different underneath it now. "Please clarify your statement." I folded my hands on the table. I had very deliberately not looked around the chamber at the chaos unfolding. I kept my eyes on Zorath. "There is nothing to clarify, Arbiter," I said. The word was precise. "Earth does not accept the proposed remedy. We did not come here to negotiate the terms of a punishment we consider unjust." Another wave of noise rolled through the chamber. I heard the translation arrays working overtime, the low hum rising into something almost audible, trying to keep pace with 400 simultaneous reactions. "Then what?" said Zorath. "Did you come here to do?" "To state our position," I said. "We have stated it. We are ready to listen if the Council has a different kind of conversation it would like to have. If not, we are content to wait." I sat back in my chair. The chair was still too small. I did not mention this. The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council, which had operated continuously for 12,000 years, and had in that time witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, the signing of treaties that reshaped the known galaxy, and the formal proceedings of more diplomatic events than any human historian had ever managed to catalog, descended into a level of disorder that 3 separate council staff members later told me, in hushed and slightly awed tones, they had never seen before in their lifetimes. I watched it happen from my low chair. I kept my hands folded. I kept my expression neutral. They had expected me to flinch. They had built a room specifically designed to make me flinch. The architecture, the seating, the lighting, the height of the Arbiter's platform, the number of eyes watching, the weight of 12,000 years pressing down from every surface. All of it was constructed to communicate one message. You are small here. You are new here. You should be grateful we are willing to speak to you at all. I understood the message. I had understood it the moment I walked in. I simply did not agree with the premise. There is a thing that happens to people from Earth, or at least to the people I have known from Earth. When they are pushed into a corner, it is not anger, exactly. It is not defiance for its own sake. It is something quieter and more stubborn than either of those things. It is the quality of a species that spent most of its history with no one appeal to but itself, no ancient authority to defer to, no higher power to hand decisions to. Just people, millions of years of them, solving problems and making mistakes and trying again, and slowly, learning to trust their own judgment. We had not always gotten it right. Anyone who had read a human history book knew that with painful clarity. We had gotten it wrong in spectacular and costly ways, more times than I cared to count. But we had also learned something from all that getting it wrong. We had learned that the size of the room has nothing to do with whether you are right. The council called a recess 40 minutes later. I was escorted, politely and with visible uncertainty, to a diplomatic observation lounge on the upper level of the station. The escort of 6 council security personnel did not restrain me or threaten me. They were, if anything, treating me with a carefulness that suggested they had not been given instructions for this particular situation, and were improvising. I walked with them calmly. I noted as I left the chamber that Arbiter Zorath had not looked away from me until the doors closed. Outside, through the observation lounge's wide windows, I could see Valanthos Station extending in both directions for what looked like hundreds of kilometers. A structure so large it had its own internal weather systems. Beyond it, the stars were steady and cold and infinite. Earth was 4 days away at standard transit speed. I thought about home for a moment, not with sadness, just to anchor myself. Then I poured a glass of water from the carafe on the lounge table, sat down in a chair that was, notably, exactly the right size for a human, and I waited to see what the oldest institution in the galaxy would do next. The recess was supposed to last 2 hours. It lasted 6. I knew this because I watched the station's time display cycle forward from my seat in the observation lounge. Glass of water untouched after the first hour, a second one poured and equally ignored after the third. The council security team that had escorted me stood near the door. They did not speak to me. They did not look at me directly. They had the particular stillness of people who had been given an assignment they did not fully understand. Through the wide windows I watched the station go through its cycles. Valanthos was old enough that it had developed its own circadian patterns, despite existing in deep space, far from any star. The lighting along its outer corridors shifted and dimmed at calculated intervals. Species from hundreds of different home environments needed different sleep cycles, different atmospheric pressures, different rhythms. The station accommodated all of them. It was, in that regard, genuinely impressive. Whatever else I thought about the institution it housed, the engineering was extraordinary. I had been in the lounge for 2 hours when the first visitor arrived. He was Velkan, but not from Zorath's delegation. He was younger, if age could be read in a species whose color range and limb control shifted in ways my briefing documents had only partially decoded. He introduced himself as Velkan Subdelegate Envar, assigned to the Council's Trade Continuity Division, and he made it very clear, before saying anything else, that he was speaking entirely off the record, and that this conversation was not being logged by Council systems. I told him I understood. I did not tell him that my personal recorder, which was standard equipment for any Earth diplomat and had been fully declared in my entry documentation, was running. He sat across from me. He looked at me for a long moment in a way that I had come to recognize, over the past several hours, as the look of someone trying to update a model that was not working properly. "We assumed," he said, "that humanity would negotiate." "I know," I said. "You always negotiate," he said. "Every species in your position negotiates. It is what one does in this chamber." "I understand why you thought that," I said. "It is not a criticism," he said quickly, and his color shifted towards something lighter. "I am not here to challenge your choice. I am here because several of my colleagues are experiencing significant difficulty processing what happened today, and I was selected to come and speak with you because I am considered, within our delegation, to be the one most comfortable with unexpected situations." "That sounds like a polite way of saying you drew the short straw," I said. There was a pause. Then his translation array produced something that might have been the Velkan equivalent of a brief, surprised laugh. "That is an apt description," he said. I leaned forward slightly. "What is it you actually want to know, Envar?" He considered this. "Why," he said finally, not as an accusation, as a genuine question. "We have extensive records on Earth. Decades of observation, your diplomatic history, your internal politics, your economic development, your previous interactions with council processes. We believed we understood your species' priorities quite well. And yet what you did today was not in any of our models. That's the problem with your models, I said. They were built on what you observed. They were not built on what we are. He was quiet for a moment. Explain the difference. I thought about how to say it simply. You watched Earth for 80 years, I said. You saw a species that wanted to join the Council. You saw 4 attempts to negotiate membership. You saw us come to the table each time, present our case, and leave without a deal. You interpreted that as failure, as desperation building over time. You thought the longer it went on, the more desperate we would become, and the more we would accept. That is a reasonable interpretation, he said carefully. It would be, I said, if what we wanted was to join the Council, but we never wanted to join the Council. What we wanted was to be treated as equals. When the Council's terms made that impossible, we walked away each time. Not because we chose to. Envar's color shifted again. I did not have a precise read on what the shade meant, but it was something in the direction of a recalibration. The Council interpreted the absence of a deal as Earth's inability to meet our requirements, he said slowly. I know, I said. And Earth interpreted the Council's terms as evidence that it had no interest in genuine partnership. 2 different conclusions from the same events. The difference is that your conclusion led you to believe you had leverage over us today. Ours led us to spend 80 years building something we did not need your permission to build. He went very still. What have you built? He said. I smiled, not a large smile, a small one. I think that's the conversation the Council should have with me in the chamber, I said. Not here. He left 20 minutes later. He was not the last visitor. Over the next 4 hours, 3 more came. A drained communications attaché who asked carefully worded questions about Earth's current trade network configuration, and left looking troubled. A Cal Sareth Jr. diplomat who was so nervous she spoke too fast for her translation array to keep up, slowed herself down with visible effort, and asked whether Earth would consider any form of bilateral arrangement outside the Council framework, before correcting herself and saying she was asking hypothetically. And finally, a member of a species I did not have a briefing document for, something large and slow-moving and very old, who sat in the chair across from me without introducing themselves, studied me for about 4 minutes, and then said in a voice my translation array rendered as something between wind and stone, "You are not afraid." "No," I said. "Most are afraid." It said, "I know," I said. It considered this. "This is either very wise or very foolish," it said. "Usually both," I said. It made a sound that my array did not translate. Then it stood and left. I never learned its name or its species, but I noted in my personal log that it had not seemed displeased. When Arbiter Zoreth finally recalled the chamber after 6 hours, I was escorted back to my small chair at the base of the room. The chamber was quieter than before. Not calm, but a different kind of not calm. The earlier eruption had been shock. This was something else. This was the specific stillness of 400 species that had been talking to each other for 6 hours and had not arrived at a consensus. I sat down. I put my hands on the table. I did not open my datapad. Zoreth looked at me from his platform with the careful expression of a very experienced being who was adjusting his approach in real time. His color had returned to formal gray, but there was something in the way he held his upper limbs that my briefing documents would have described as guarded. "Representative Vasquez," he said, "the Council has discussed your position during the recess." "Assumed it had," I said. "The formal charge against Earth remains in place," he said. "The proposed remedy also remains on record, however. The Council is willing to extend the opening session to allow Earth's representative to provide additional context for her government's position, if she wishes to do so." That was a shift in language. Additional context, not negotiation of terms, not a request for an apology. Additional context. It was small, but it was real. Zoreth was cracking a door. I did not rush through it. "I appreciate the extension," I said. "Before I speak, I would like to ask the Council a question." A ripple moved through the chamber. Questions from the lower-tier delegate were not standard procedure. Zoreth's color shifted briefly before returning to gray. "You may ask," he said. "In the Council's 80 years of observing Earth," I said clearly and without any heat in my voice, "did the Council ever send a formal inquiry to Earth's government asking what terms of partnership Earth would find acceptable?" Silence. "Not a proposal," I said. "Not a set of terms for Earth to accept or reject. A genuine inquiry. What do you want? What would partnership look like to you?" Did the Council ever ask that question? The silence continued. It was a different kind of silence than before. Not shock. Something more like the particular quiet of a room in which a very obvious thing has just been said for the first time. Zoreth's color moved through something brief and complex. "The Council's standard process," he said after a moment, "is to assess a candidate species and determine appropriate terms based on that assessment." That was not an answer to my question, I said. very gently. Another longer this time. No, said Zorith finally. The council did not ask that question. I nodded once. Then I would like to answer it now, I said. That is the context I would like to provide. What happened next was not an eruption. It was quieter than that. It was the sound of 400 delegations shifting in their seats at roughly the same moment. A soft collective movement that the translation arrays caught the edges of. Something between attention and the very early stages of a thing that might become understanding. I reached for my datapad, not the one with the approved opening statement on it. A second one that I had been carrying in my bag and that no committee back on Earth had reviewed. I had written what was on it myself alone in my cabin, 3 nights out from Valanthos, after I had finished reading every document and made my decision. I opened it. I looked up at Zorith. I began to speak. I told the council what Earth wanted, not what we would accept, not what we were prepared to concede, what we actually wanted: equal standing, full sovereign recognition of our settled systems, open trade based on mutual benefit rather than hierarchical permission, a seat at tables where decisions affecting our species were made, not a waiting room outside those tables. The right to expand into unclaimed space without requiring advance approval from an institution we had never joined. The right to say no when something was wrong, and to say yes when something was right, and to have both of those answers respected as the choices of a free people. I spoke for 40 minutes. No one interrupted me. When I finished, the chamber was the quietest it had been since I walked in. Zorith looked at me for a long time. His color did something I had no reference for in any of my briefing documents. Something slow and deep that moved from his center outward. That, he said finally, is a great deal to ask for. Yes, I said. But you ask, well, that is what we want. He was quiet again. Then, and if the council declines to offer those terms, then we will be in the same position we have been in for 80 years, I said. And we will continue as we have been, building what we need, doing what we believe is right. We are not asking for permission to exist, Arbiter. We are asking whether the council would like to be part of a relationship with a species that is going to exist regardless. Something moved through the chamber, not noise this time. Something beneath noise. Something more like a pressure, the sensation of a very large and very old room recognizing that the conversation inside it had changed shape. Zorith called a second recess. This one lasted 14 hours. During that time I slept 4 hours in the diplomatic suite, ate 2 meals from the station's human-compatible food stores, and received 7 more visitors. Not aides or junior delegates this time. Senior figures. Names and species that I recognized from my briefing documents as significant voices in the council's internal structure. They came one at a time. They asked serious questions. I gave them serious answers. And in the spaces between those conversations I wrote in my log. And I thought about Bristol, and I thought about the flooding, and I thought about the way the water used to come up over the garden wall in the night, and my mother would stand at the window watching it without any visible alarm, her arms crossed, her expression simply assessing, already calculating what needed to be done when the sun came up. She had taught me that. The importance of just watching, when watching was what the moment required. Not performing calm, actually being calm, because calm is not the absence of awareness. It is the absence of panic. And panic, my mother used to say, is just energy with no direction. She would have found this entire situation very interesting. The second day of the session opened differently. I noticed it the moment I walked into the chamber. The lighting had shifted. It was subtle, a few degrees warmer. The sharp overhead intensity of the previous day softened slightly at the base level. The translation arrays were running quieter. 3 of the delegations that had been loudest in their shock the day before were seated with a different arrangement, clustered together in a way that looked deliberate, and my chair, the small one at the lowest tier, had been moved. Not much, perhaps half a meter forward, and elevated by a platform I had not seen the day before, narrow and plain but unmistakably real. I was still below the main tier level, but I was no longer at the floor. I registered all of this without expression. I sat down. Arbiters avoid and open with a restatement of the charges. He opened with a procedural announcement that the session had been redesignated from a formal hearing to a consultative dialogue. In council terms, I knew from my briefing documents, this was a significant reclassification. A formal hearing was one-directional. A consultative dialogue had the structure of a genuine exchange. It was the first formal acknowledgement, buried in procedure, that yesterday had changed something. Then he turned his full attention to me and said, "The council has reviewed Earth's stated position. Before this body can respond substantively, we have questions." "I welcome them," I said. "Earth claims self-sufficiency," he said. "The council's economic assessment models, current as of 14 months ago, indicate that Earth and its affiliated systems carry a significant dependence on Council-adjacent trade networks for 17 categories of industrial materials. 14 months ago, I let that land with the chamber for a moment before I responded. I did not say anything about the 14 months directly. I simply opened my datapad and said, I am happy to share Earth's current self-sufficiency index as of last quarter. I transmitted it to the chamber's shared display system. Numbers appeared on the screens that ran along every tier. Not just my numbers, a full breakdown, system by system, material category by material category, showing the current state of Earth's production, storage, and supply chain infrastructure. Murmuring began almost immediately. The index was not a weapon. I want to be precise about that, because it would be easy to describe what happened next as a kind of trap, as though I had been holding this information back in order to produce it dramatically and watch the council reel. That is not what it was. It was information. Accurate current openly shared. The council had not asked for it before. I was offering it now because the question had been asked. But the information, when it hit the screens, had an effect. 40 years. That was the span of time it represented. 40 years of Earth-building parallel infrastructure, not in secret, not as a conspiracy, but as a quiet and persistent response to being excluded from the networks that every other spacefaring species in the galaxy took for granted. When the Council's terms for trade access were structured in ways that required Earth to cede regulatory control over its own industrial output, Earth had declined the access and found other ways. When Council-adjacent transit corridors came with surveillance and reporting requirements that treated Earth as a monitored subject rather than a sovereign partner, Earth had invested in its own propulsion research and mapped its own corridors. When medical and agricultural technology sharing required membership fees that were calculated on a scale that seemed designed to be unaffordable, Earth had developed its own. Not all of it was as good as what the Council's networks offered. Some of it was significantly worse. The early decades had been difficult in ways that most humans alive today had no direct memory of. But it had been built. It existed. And at this point, after 40 years, it was good enough. Better than good enough, in several categories. Earth's parallel energy grid, the one developed after the third failed membership negotiation, was currently more efficient than the Council's standard equivalent by a margin that was making several of the delegations on the upper tiers very quiet. These figures, said Zorath carefully, represent a significant change from the Council's current models. Yes, I said. When did this development reach its current state? The critical threshold, where Earth's parallel infrastructure became sufficient to sustain all colony systems without Council-adjacent trade. Access was crossed approximately 11 years ago, I said. The more recent development is the efficiency margin in the energy sector, which we reached about 3 years ago. 11 years, the Chamber absorbed this. 11 years during which the Council had been operating on an assumption of Earth's dependence that was no longer true, an assumption that had shaped every element of the strategy they had deployed yesterday, including the proposed moratorium and the implicit threat that Earth could not afford to refuse. Zorath's color shifted. I watched the movement and I thought, not unkindly, that he had just understood something significant about the last 11 years of Council policy. Decisions, the proposed interdiction, he said slowly, would affect Earth's access to Council-adjacent trade networks. Yes, I said. The data you have provided suggests that this would have a limited impact on Earth's essential supply chains. Yes, I said. However, I added, before he could continue, I want to be precise. An interdiction would cause disruption. I am not claiming otherwise. Trade is trade, and access is better than isolation. The question is not whether an interdiction would affect Earth. The question is whether it would achieve what the Council intends it to achieve. I paused, and the answer to that question is no, it would not. More quiet from the upper tiers. The kind of quiet that means people are running numbers. Then I said the second part, the part I had been waiting to say until the first part had fully settled. I would also note, I said, that 12 Council member species currently maintain trade arrangements that run through human-held jump corridor licenses. Those corridors were developed independently by Earth and are not part of the Council's registered transit network. An interdiction order would not automatically suspend those licenses. That would require a separate action from each of those 12 species, but it would create an incentive question for each of them. Whether disrupting their existing arrangements with Earth, which are operating efficiently and at favorable terms, is worth the benefit of Council solidarity in a dispute that does not directly affect their interests. I let that sit. Zorath did not move. His color had settled into something I did not have a word for. Measured, recalibrating. Across the chamber, I could see delegates leaning toward each other. The translation arrays were picking up dozens of side conversations happening. Simultaneously in the upper tiers, the murmur of 400 species reassessing a situation they had believed, 24 hours ago, was entirely under control. Representative Vasquez, said Zorath, and his voice had changed very slightly. The absolute solidity of it softened by something approaching actual inquiry. How long has Earth been planning for this session? 80 years. I said simply, give or take. There was something in the chamber after that, a sound I could not quite name. Not laughter, not alarm. Something closer to the specific quality of air in a room when something very large shifts on its foundation. The session continued for several more hours. I answered questions, I provided documents, I did not exaggerate, and I did not diminish. When a senior delegate from a species called the Marin Vet asked, with considerable precision, whether Earth was making a covert threat to leverage its corridor licenses as economic retaliation, I said no, clearly and without hesitation. We were not making any threats. We were providing accurate information about the situation so that the Council could make decisions based on reality, rather than outdated models. That was the entirety of what I was doing, and that, I said, was itself an illustration of what we were offering. Not dominance, not negotiated supremacy. Information honestly given in a context of genuine exchange. The kind of relationship that the Council's current structure, which was built on the assumption that new members came in from a position of need and gratitude, had never quite created space for. A delegate I had not spoken to yet, from a species called the Ithene, raised a question during the third hour that stopped the room in a way nothing else had quite managed. The Ithene were not one of the major powers in the Council. They were a small species, technologically modest by galactic standards, and their delegation was seated in the middle tiers, neither prominent nor marginal. Their delegate was named Chorus, and when she spoke, her voice through my translation array was careful and direct, in a way that felt different from the more formal tones I had been navigating all day. I have a question, she said, that is not about trade or corridors or infrastructure. Please, I said. My species joined the Council 400 years ago, she said. The terms we accepted were not favorable. We ceded oversight of 2 of our outer systems for the first century of membership. We accepted trade restrictions that limited our manufacturing output for 50 years. We agreed because we were told this was the standard process, and because we believed that the Council represented something worth belonging to. She paused. Over time, those restrictions were lifted. We have been members in reasonably good standing since then. But I have always wondered, in the back of my thinking, whether we needed to accept those original terms, whether a different choice was possible. The chamber was very quiet. What I am asking, she said, is not a strategic question, it is this. Are you afraid? Not of the Council, not of the outcome, just as an individual sitting in that chair. Are you afraid? I thought about this honestly, not performing the answer, actually thinking about it. I have been nervous, I said. This morning, before I walked in. Yesterday before I walked in, that is true. But afraid, I considered, no, I do not think so. I know what I believe is right. I know what Earth wants. I know what I came here to say. When you know those things clearly, the size of the room stops being a source of fear and starts being something you can simply observe. Chorus was quiet for a moment. Then she said, thank you. That was the answer I hoped for. She sat back. She did not speak again for the rest of the session, but I noticed, as the session continued, that several of the delegates in the middle tiers were watching her, and then watching me, and then watching each other, with an expression I did not have a briefing document for. It looked, the closest I could describe it, like the expression of someone remembering something they had not thought about in a very long time. By the time Zorath called the end of the second day's session, the proposed interdiction had been mentioned once briefly by a Velcon junior delegate and had not been picked up by anyone else in the room. It was not formally dropped. It was simply not being carried anymore. It had been set down somewhere in the third hour and had not been retrieved. Zorath announced that the Council would require time to formulate a substantive response to Earth's position, and that a third session would be convened in 16 hours. 16 hours. I noted the number. Yesterday's recess had been 6 hours, then 14. The intervals were getting longer. This was not the Council stalling. This was the Council genuinely working through something it had not expected to need to work through. I thanked the Arbiter formally. I stood from my chair. I walked out of the chamber through the same doors I had entered, past the same security escort, through the same corridors, but the station felt different on the walk back to my suite. I could not say exactly how. The lighting was the same. The architecture had not changed. The sounds of 400 species going about their business filled the corridors the same way they always had. What was different, I decided, was me. Or not me exactly, my position in the space. Yesterday I had walked these corridors as the representative of a species on trial. Today I walked them as something else. Something the council did not quite have a word for yet, because the category was new. I went back to my suite. I ate a proper meal for the first time since arriving on the station. I slept 6 hours, dreamlessly. In the morning I would have 16 bilateral meeting requests waiting for me. I would deal with them methodically, one at a time, with patience and precision, and the same honest directness I had used in the chamber. I would listen carefully to each species that came to me, and I would answer each of them clearly, and I would not promise anything I could not deliver, or ask for anything I did not actually want. But that was morning. For now, I sat at the window of my suite and looked out at the stars, and thought about what my mother would say when I told her. About the chair. The meeting requests arrived before my alarm went off. I had estimated 16, there were 22. I lay in bed for a moment, reading through the list on my personal display, blinking sleep out of my eyes, and I counted them twice because the number did not seem real. 22 species requesting direct meetings with Earth's diplomatic representative, outside the Council's formal session structure, before the next chamber convening in 13 hours. 22 separate species that had decided, in the course of a single night, that whatever was happening was something they wanted to be part of before it finished happening. I got up. I showered. I made notes. I sat at the small table near the window for a few minutes before the first meeting, and I looked at what I had accomplished in 2 days and what still needed to happen in the next 13 hours, and I thought about what each of those 22 requests actually meant. Not diplomatically, personally. Each request was a species looking at what I had done and making a choice, a real choice, not a forced one, not a calculated one, but a genuine reaching towards something they recognized as better than what they currently had. That was worth thinking about before the first visitor arrived. I did not have enough time to think about it fully. I filed it away, in the back of my mind, in the category of things I would return to later, when the work was done and the station was behind me, and there was space to actually feel what the last 2 days had meant. I was ready to receive the first visitor within 40 minutes. Her name was Ambassador Thessa. She was Dren, and she arrived alone, which I noted because every other diplomatic interaction I had observed on Valanthos involved aides. She carried no datapad. She sat down across from me in the meeting room off my suite, and she looked at me with large, pale eyes that I had learned, from my briefing documents, expressed directness in her species in the same way that sustained eye contact expresses attention in humans. "My government has been in contact with me through the night," she said without preamble. "They have reviewed the material you shared in the chamber yesterday. The economic data. I assumed they would," I said. "They have specific interest in the energy sector figures," she said. "The efficiency margins." "I am not surprised," I said. "We have been paying council standard rates for energy infrastructure access for 300 years," she said. "The margin your data shows suggests we have been significantly overpaying for a significant portion of that time." I said nothing. This was true. She knew I knew it was true. We were both aware that me confirming it out loud would be a kind of thing, and that kind of thing was better handled when both parties were ready for it. "I am not here to renegotiate anything today," she said. "I am here to understand what Earth actually intends. Not in terms of the Council, in terms of the future." "What specifically would you like to understand?" I said. "The proposal you submitted to 14 species simultaneously this morning," she said, and I noted that this was before I had sent it, which meant either she had a source I was not tracking, or the Council's information network was faster than I had accounted for. "The Open Corridor Compact. I have seen the framework outline." I had sent the framework outline at 5 in the morning, local station time, 3 hours before the first meeting request arrived. 14 species, chosen specifically because they had either approached me directly during the session, or whose aides had been among my visitors during the first day. Recesses. The compact was not yet a treaty. It was not a finished document, it was a framework, 10 pages clearly written, describing a new kind of arrangement between Earth and any interested species, outside the Council's membership structure, based on mutual access, legal equality, and shared infrastructure agreements negotiated individually rather than imposed collectively. "What questions do you have about it?" I said. She considered. "It is not a competing governing body," she said. "No," I said. "It does not require members to leave the Council, no." I said. It requires members to recognize Earth-settled systems as sovereign territory. Yes, I said. That is a foundation requirement, not negotiable. She nodded once, slowly. My government is prepared to offer Dren outer belt mining access in exchange for preferred corridor licensing, she said. That is an interesting starting point, I said. I am aware it is only a starting point, she said. I am also aware that 12 other species are currently drafting their own opening offers. I would prefer not to be 12th. I looked at her. She looked at me. There was an honesty to the interaction that I found genuinely pleasant after 2 days of navigating formal chamber procedure. I cannot guarantee priority, I said, but I can guarantee that every offer will be considered with equal seriousness, and that no arrangement will be finalized without full transparency with all other compact members. She accepted this. We talked for another 40 minutes about specifics. Real specifics, the kind that required thinking and note-taking, rather than prepared statements. She had done her research. She asked careful, well-formed questions. When she left, her expression was not satisfied exactly, but it was settled in a way that it had not been when she arrived. The next visitor was Calcerath Senior Envoy Owen, who had replaced the nervous junior diplomat from the first day. He was older, steadier, and came with 2 aides and a security officer, which told me the Calcerath government had escalated the conversation on their end since yesterday. He asked about mutual defense. I told him that the compact in its current form was an economic and infrastructure arrangement, not a military alliance. He asked whether that was a permanent limitation. I told him it was a current one. He seemed to find this sufficient. After Owen came a pair of delegates from a species I had read about but never encountered directly, the Selen, who were distant members of the council, with a historical reputation for staying neutral in most major disputes. They had been neutral for so long that they had apparently forgotten what it felt like to have a position. They sat across from me with a kind of bright anxiety that I recognized from humans who had been holding back for a long time and were considering stopping. They asked 3 questions, all of which circled the same core inquiry. Define real, I said, not a negotiating tactic. The senior one said, not a play to force the council to improve its membership terms, an actual offer, an actual alternative. Yes, I said, an actual alternative. They looked at each other. Something passed between them that I could not read. Then they looked back at me. We will need to consult our government, the senior one said. Of course, I said. But we will consult with recommendation, the other added, quietly, as if this were a significant thing to say. Given what I knew of the Selen's 3 centuries of deliberate neutrality, it was. The 4th meeting of the morning was with a delegate I had not been able to fully brief myself on beforehand. Because the species she represented, the Tavathi, had almost no public-facing diplomatic record. They were members of the council in the technical sense. Their name appeared in the membership rolls, but they had not sent a representative to a council session in over 60 years. The delegate was small and moved with a deliberate slowness that I quickly recognized was not hesitation but precision. Her name was Sarah, and she asked me, before anything else, how I had learned to be patient. The question surprised me. I showed it, briefly, and she noticed. I ask because, she said, my species made the decision 60 years ago to withdraw from participation. We reached a point where every session, every proposal, every exchange cost us more than it returned. We chose silence over continued loss. She paused. Yesterday I watched something happen in that chamber that I have not seen in my lifetime. I am here to understand what kind of patience produces that. I thought about it genuinely. I am not sure patience is the right word, I said. Patience suggests waiting for conditions to change. I think what I learned is better described as clarity, knowing what you want clearly enough that you do not need the approval of the room to trust your own direction. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Clarity, she repeated. My mother, I said, used to say that calm is not the absence of awareness, it is the absence of panic. When you are clear about what you want and why, panic has nothing to attach itself to. She considered this carefully. The Tavathi have been waiting for conditions to change for 60 years, she said. Perhaps we have been using the wrong word for it as well. She stayed for 2 hours. We did not discuss the compact in detail. We talked about process and principle, about what made a negotiation genuine versus performative, about the difference between a framework that grew from mutual interest and one that was handed down from above. When she left, she said she would be in contact with her government. She said it like someone who had not said that phrase in a long time, and was surprised to find it felt true again. The meetings continued through the morning and into the afternoon. Between the 5th and 6th, I took 20 minutes to eat, standing at the window of my suite, watching the station's artificial light shift through its midday cycle. I thought about what I was building. It was not, I was careful to remind myself, a rebellion. It was not an attack on the council. The Open Compact was not designed to destroy anything that already existed. It was designed to create something new. A parallel structure, honest about what it was. A way for species that had been inside the council's framework for centuries, deferring and compromising and paying costs, that had always been presented as standard, to have a different kind of relationship. Not instead of the council, alongside it. The council would adapt, or it would not. That was not mine to control. What was mine was the offer, honestly made, clearly stated, and extended to anyone who wanted it. The seventh meeting introduced the first complication of the day. A senior delegate named Harlow, representing a mid-tier council species called the Venth, arrived with 3 aides and a formal objection. Not to the compact itself, but to the sovereignty clause. Earth's settled systems included one star system, designated Kepler-7 in our own cataloging, that the Venth had historically claimed as a cultural site of significance. Not settled, not administered, but significant. They had a ceremony there, conducted every 40 years, at a specific point in the system's primary's orbit. I listened to the full explanation. I asked 3 clarifying questions. Then I told Harlow that Earth had no interest in preventing the Venth from conducting their ceremony, that cultural access provisions were entirely compatible with the sovereignty framework, and that a specific carve-out for the Kepler-7 site could be written into any bilateral arrangement between Earth and the Venth as a standing right of access. Harlow looked at me with an expression I had come to recognize from the last 2 days. The expression of someone who had come prepared for a conflict and found the door already open. "You anticipated this concern," he said. "I anticipated that territorial recognition would surface specific historical claims," I said. "That is normal. It is also solvable. The sovereignty clause protects administration, not access. Those are different things." He absorbed this. His aides were writing quickly. "The Venth Council will want this in writing," he said. "I will have a draft provision to you within 2 hours," I said. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment and then said something I did not expect. "We did not expect you to be reasonable," he said. "I want to be transparent about that. We came in expecting to be told no." "Why?" I said. He considered how to answer. "Because the Council's framework teaches us to expect inflexibility at the level of foundational terms," he said. "Foundational terms are presented as absolute, non-negotiable. You either accept them as written or you do not proceed." He paused. "You are treating foundational terms as a starting point." "They are," I said. "Every framework has to start somewhere. The start does not have to be the end." He looked at me for a moment with something that was not quite gratitude but was adjacent to it. "I think," he said carefully, "that we have been inside the Council's framework for so long that we forgot other frameworks were possible." He left with a draft provision request, and I noted a slightly different posture than when he had arrived. When I sat down for the 14th meeting of the day, with a delegate from a species called the Rhineth, who asked me a version of the question I had now heard 6 times in different forms. "What made you think this would work?" I gave them the same answer I had given the others, but this time I found the clearest version of it. "I did not think about whether it would work," I said. "I thought about whether it was right. Those are different questions. I can only control one of them." The Rhineth delegate looked at me for a moment and then wrote something on his datapad. I did not ask what. I took a 15-minute break after the 16th meeting and sat quietly with a cup of tea that had gone cold. My notes by that point were extensive. Specific requests, specific concerns, specific proposals that would need drafting. The compact was no longer just a framework in my mind. It was already acquiring the specific texture of a real thing, the weight of actual details agreed upon by actual parties with actual stakes. That weight was good. It meant it was real. I thought about the team back on Earth who had briefed me for this mission. The committees that had reviewed my approved opening statement. The senior diplomats who had counseled conciliation and a managed retreat on terms. They were not wrong about the risks. They understood the stakes. What they had not accounted for was what happened when you took those stakes seriously enough to refuse the expected path and find a different one. I would need to call them before the final session. I drafted a short message, 2 sentences, to Earth's Secretary of Outer Affairs. I told her the situation had developed in a positive direction and that I would provide a full report when I returned. I did not use the word unprecedented, though I considered it. The word would worry people who were already worried. The details would say enough on their own. By the time the 16th hour approached and it was time to prepare for the 3rd and likely final session of the Council, I had met with 19 of the 22 species that had requested time. 3 had not been able to schedule before the session reconvened. I sent each of them a message asking if they would like to continue after the chamber concluded its work. All 3 responded within minutes, yes. I put on my formal diplomatic jacket. I looked at myself in the mirror for a moment. I noted that I looked tired, and that tired and afraid were not the same thing, and that this particular tiredness was the kind that came from doing something real, rather than enduring something. I thought about what my father used to say. He was an engineer who spent his career building structures designed to survive unexpected forces. He used to say that the best structures were not the ones that never bent. They were the ones that bent without breaking, and then adjusted their tolerances based on what the bending taught them. He had not been talking about diplomacy. He had been talking about bridges. But the principle traveled. I picked up my datapad, the second one, the personal one, the one with the things I had written myself. I walked back to the chamber. The grand chamber looked the same, ancient and enormous and built to communicate permanence. The same 600 rows of tiered seating, the same translation arrays humming at the edge of hearing, the same vapor cloud ceiling. But if you had been here for all 3 days, as I had, you could feel the difference in the way you can feel weather changing before it is visible. The chair at the base of the room had been elevated again, same small platform from the second day, but now it was a touch higher, still below the main tier, still lower than every other diplomatic seat. But the gap had narrowed a second time, and this time I did not think it was accidental. I sat down, I placed my datapad on the table. I did not fold my hands, I simply waited, alert and at ease in the way that came from 2 days of knowing exactly what I was doing here. Arbiter Zorath opened the session without preamble. The Council has reviewed Earth's position and the supporting materials provided, he said. We have also noted with interest the communications that Earth's representative has been conducting with member species during the intersession. Period. A small wave of awareness moved through the upper tiers. Everyone knew about the bilateral meetings, 22 species. The Council's information network was not as slow as I had briefly hoped. The Council does not object to Earth's engagement with member species on matters of mutual interest, Zorath continued. And the precision of that phrasing was itself a document, because 3 days ago the Council would not have needed to clarify that it did not object. It would simply have issued the objection. However, the Council is entitled to understand what Earth is proposing to its members before that proposal moves forward. That is a reasonable position, I said. I am happy to provide a full briefing on the Open Corridor Compact framework, the Council as a body. I had planned to offer this at the opening of today's session, another small ripple. I had planned to offer it, not in response to the Council's inquiry. It was already on my list. I walked them through the compact, not the 10-page framework in full, but the structure and the principles. What it was not, who could join, what membership required, and what it provided. I spoke clearly and without defensiveness, because there was nothing to defend. The compact was a straightforward thing. Its straightforwardness was, in a sense, its entire point. As I spoke, I watched the chamber. I had learned over 3 days how to read the room in broad terms. The species that were engaged versus the ones running internal calculations versus the ones that had already decided and were waiting for the session to end so they could act. The Dren delegation was completely still in the focused way that indicated processing. The Cal Serath were conferring in whispers. The Selen were watching me with that bright held-breath attention I had seen in their private meeting. And Zorath. Zorath listened the way someone listens when they are not just hearing words but measuring something beneath them. He did not interrupt. He did not shift position. His color stayed in the formal gray range for the entire time I spoke, but toward the end there was something in the edges of it, a very slight movement that I had not seen from him before. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. The compact as described, he said, does not require Earth to withdraw from Council consideration, no, I said. It is a parallel structure, yes. Built on a principle of legal equality between participants, yes. The Council's membership structure also includes elements of legal equality, he said. Yes, I said carefully. The difference is that the Council's equality is tiered. Founding members, senior members, junior members, different access levels, different voting weights, different terms depending on when you joined and under what circumstances. The compact has one tier, one set of terms for every participant. No one is more of a member than anyone else. Zorath's color moved. A slow, definite shift. That structure, he said, would require a founding member like the Velkon to accept the same standing as a newly joined species like Earth. Yes, I said. It would require that of every member, including Earth. We would be bound by the same structure we ask others to accept. That is not a compromise. It is the principle. Silence, long silence, the kind that I had learned over 3 days, to simply sit inside without filling it. Then chorus. The Ithene delegate from the middle tiers spoke. She had not been scheduled to address the chamber. It was unusual for a middle-tier delegate to speak without recognition from the arbiter. She did it anyway, and Zorath, notably, did not stop her. Arbiter, she said, I would like to ask the council to consider something. The chair acknowledges delegate chorus, Zorath said, after a brief pause. We have been debating whether Earth's position is a challenge to the council, she said. But I want to suggest that we are asking the wrong question. The right question is what the council is for. She paused. We were founded to maintain peace and facilitate cooperation between spacefaring species. That is the original purpose. Not to set terms of admission, not to manage who gets access to what at what price. Those are things we became over time, because no one pushed back against them. She paused again. Someone is pushing back, and instead of asking how we stop them, I think we should ask whether they are pushing in a direction we actually want to go. The chamber was very quiet. Zorath's color had done something I had never seen before. It had shifted to something light and open, almost luminous, that none of my briefing documents had a label for. I decided it was something like clarity. The council, he said slowly, will vote on the proposed interdiction. Every attention in the room sharpened. All in favor of proceeding with the interdiction as proposed, he said. I counted the voting lights as they appeared on the chamber display. 1, 3, 6, 7, then nothing. 7 out of 400. And 3 of those 7 were Velcon sub-delegations whose votes I suspected Zorath himself had not coordinated. The interdiction does not carry, Zorath said. He did not say it with satisfaction or with defeat. He said it as a fact. The council will take Earth's proposed open corridor compact framework under formal review and will respond with its position within 30 days. I let out a single quiet breath that no one was close enough to hear. In the interim, Zorath continued, the council recognizes that member species may engage with Earth's representative on matters of mutual interest, and that any preliminary arrangements reached during this period will be subject to council review under standard procedures. Another pause. This council also formally acknowledges that its prior models of Earth's position were based on incomplete information. That acknowledgement will be entered into the session record. That last part was extraordinary. The council acknowledging, formally on record, that it had been wrong about us. I thought for a brief and genuine moment about my father. He had been an engineer. He had spent his career building structures designed to survive unexpected forces. He used to say that the best structures were not the ones that never bent. They were the ones that bent without breaking, and then adjusted their tolerances based on what the bending taught them. He would have found this entire session very interesting. The council, Zorath said, has a final question for Earth's representative. Yes, Arbiter, I said. Is Earth interested in council membership, he said. Under revised terms. I looked up at him. I took my time. Earth is interested in a genuine conversation about what terms would work for both parties, I said. That is a different thing from being interested in membership under terms the council sets and Earth accepts. If the council is asking whether we would enter into a real negotiation, the answer is yes. If the council is asking whether we would accept revised terms without that negotiation, the answer is the same as it was on the first day. Zorath looked at me for a long moment. A real negotiation head. Yes, I said. We will discuss it, he said. And then, for the first time in 3 days, his color shifted into something that his briefing document, which I had mostly ignored for the behavioral notes and focused on instead for the procedural information, described as warmth. I suspect, he said, that it will be an interesting conversation. I expect so, I said. The session closed 20 minutes later. The formal language was standard, ceremonial, the same words that had been used to close every council session for 12,000 years. But the room felt different when they were spoken. Not resolved, not finished, opened. Like a door that had been stuck for a very long time and had finally, under the right pressure applied in the right direction, swung free. I gathered my data pads. I stood. I walked out through the same doors I had entered 3 days ago. In the corridor outside, Ambassador Thessa was waiting. She was not there officially. She was simply standing, alone with no aid, in the kind of casual proximity that said she had calculated the timing of my exit. The Drain Council voted this morning, she said as I approached. We are applying for open corridor membership. We would like an Earth delegation present for the signing. I stopped walking. I looked at her. We will be there, I said. She nodded once. Then, in a way that felt unpracticed, like someone doing something they had not done in a long time, she smiled. I walked back to my suite. I sat at the window. The stars were the same as they had always been. Cold and steady and infinite in a way that had nothing to do with human decisions or galactic councils or the slow grinding work of building something better than what existed before. They were just stars. They did not care what happened down here. I found that very comforting. I opened my personal log and I wrote the final entry from Valanthos Station. 3 days, 2 sessions, 1 word that started everything. 22 bilateral meetings. 14 framework invitations sent, 19 responses received, all positive. 1 interdiction voted down, 7-0 in meaningful terms. 1 formal acknowledgement of error from the oldest institution in the galaxy. 1 door open, uncertain what is on the other side. Going to find out. I flagged it private, I closed it. Then I opened my messages and composed a reply to Thessa. 3 sentences, confirming the Earth delegation's attendance at the Drain signing, suggesting a date, and asking whether she had dietary preferences for the reception. She replied in 4 minutes. She had preferences. They were detailed and specific and slightly unexpected. I noted them down. I flagged the file for whoever would be handling catering. Then I packed my bag, made 1 last note to the crew of the Resolute to prepare for departure, and walked to the window 1 final time before leaving my suite. I thought about Bristol, about flooding water and a woman standing at a window, arms crossed, already planning. About a chair that was too small, and what it means when you sit in it anyway. About 12,000 years of an institution meeting 1 species that had simply decided, quietly and without drama, to stop being impressed by how old the room was. We had not come to win. We had not come to take anything. We had come to say what we were, clearly, without performance, in a language that did not require translation. And somewhere in the space between the saying and the hearing, something had shifted that could not easily be shifted back. I did not know what would come next. Negotiations always surprised you. The compact would grow in ways I had not planned for. The council would push back in ways I had not predicted. Species that had seemed interested would withdraw, and species I had never spoken to would step forward. There would be difficult sessions and frustrating ones and ones, where I would sit alone in a room and wonder if I had miscalculated something important, but today had happened. It was in the record now. Formally entered into the session logs of the Galactic Council, accessible to every species in the galaxy. Earth had been called to answer for its existence, and instead of answering, it had asked a question. And the oldest institution in the galaxy had gone quiet, and then it had adjusted, and then slowly it had begun to listen. I picked up my bag. I walked to the door. The stars were waiting. The work was waiting. Home was 4 days away. I stepped out into the corridor and I started walking.